And Darwin did not, as you nicely just put it, Chris, he was not survival of the fittest. He was survival of the kindest. And that comes straight out of The Descent of Man from 1871. And no one knows that, right? And everybody thinks he said it's survival of the superior. He didn't say that.
Hi, my name is Lindsay, hailing from Seattle, Washington. Right now I'm sitting outside in the grass while my 2 rescue pups run around. I acquired them early on in the onset of the pandemic. And I also did quite a bit of baking throughout the pandemic. And I have been particularly enjoying the recipes that you all put out with your newsletters. I've been starting every day so far of my summer break. I'm a teacher, so I just started my summer break. I've been starting every day with a delicious cold brew mud latte. And I just couldn't think of a better way to start my day. I decided to give up coffee this past year. My colleagues thought I was crazy. What a year to decide to do that. But I knew that I didn't want to deal with the highs and the lows and the crashes that come with caffeine. My school's been teaching in person since August throughout the pandemic, so it's been a very challenging year. And I am very grateful that I made the switch. So keep the recipes coming. I thank you so much for what you do, and have a happy summer.
Lindsay, so glad you're enjoying your summer, and thank you for sending that in. We've got some mud water being sent to your doorstep right meow. And if anyone else wants to send in a voice memo, just bust out your phone, record less than a minute of audio, let us know who you are, where you're listening from, and some details about yourself, about your surroundings. What does it look like in your crazy human experience spinning around on this blue jewel suspended vast vacuum space that we call Earth? We want to know about who you are. And if we play it, we'll send you a free tin of mud. You can just record on your phone and email it to podcast@mudwtr.com. Again, keep it under a minute, and we'd love to play it. Welcome to Trends with Benefits. My name is Kyle Tierman, and before we get going, I want to let you know that we just released the Trends with Benefits newspaper. Oh yeah, we talk about psychedelics, adventure, well-being. We've got articles in there from MAPS founder Rick Doblin, a lot of humor articles, crossword puzzles, astrology. It was a really fun project, and you can go to mudwtr.com, click the shop button, scroll all the way down to the bottom of the products page, and get a newspaper sent to your doorstep. It's a nice way to slow down, detox from your phone, and just exhale and enjoy the morning. So go pick up the Trends with Benefits newspaper right now. This episode of the podcast was a three-way co-hosted by my friend, Dr. Christopher Ryan. He is the co-author of the best-selling book, Sex at Dawn, as well as more recently the book Civilized to Death, as well as the wildly popular podcast, Tangentially Speaking. We co-hosted it and interviewed Dacher Keltner, who is a researcher who focuses on the biological and evolutionary origins of compassion, awe, love, beauty, power, social class, and inequality. He's the co-author of 2 textbooks, as well as the best-selling book Born to be Good, The Science of a Meaningful Life, and The Compassionate Instinct. He has published over 190 scientific articles and written for the New York Times, the London Times, the Wall Street Journal, SLATE, and has received numerous national prizes and grants for his research. His research has been covered hundreds of times, including in Time, Newsweek, the New York Times, BBC, the Wall Street Journal, and many others. Please welcome to the show Dr. Christopher Ryan and Dr. Dacher Keltner. So you're focused on awe right now. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I in my lab, the Berkeley Social Interaction Lab, we work from the perspective that we've evolved a set of emotions that help us adapt to the environment and fold into social communities and survive and do well. And early in the field, people focused on fight or flight emotions like anger and fear, and we know a lot about those. And they'd really, like scientists had really left untouched these really interesting spaces of emotion, like gratitude and awe and ecstasy and joy. And the reason that I study it is in part, I was really lucky to be raised by parents. My mom's teaches literature, my dad's an artist, who are like, get out in the wild, swim in the Pacific Ocean, let's go camping, let's drive a VW bus through the Colorado Rockies. And I was just raised on awe, And then heading into my career, once it was established, I had developed the scientific tools and the background to study this amazing emotion that mystics have been writing about for thousands of years, that had a very prominent role in the Age of Enlightenment and Romanticism in the 18th century. I mean, it's foundational to everything. And science really hadn't studied it. So we got into the game.
Will you be talking about the role of psychedelics, for example, in creating that sense of awe and the inspiration, how sort of the psychedelic movement combined with technology in Silicon Valley has given rise to the whole technological revolution? Is that something you're looking at?
Yeah, in fact, at Berkeley, we are just launching the Berkeley Psychedelic Research Center. We have Michael Pollan and Alison Gopnik and me and a few others, Michael Silver, to try to understand scientifically what psychedelics do. We know what they do. We know what they do phenomenologically, just how they change our lives and give us a sense of connecting to vast things that we can't describe. And then Roland Griffiths did early work on the clinical implications of psychedelics, just helping handle anxiety and so forth, that have really opened up the field. And then our work will really get at this idea that the core of psychedelics is awe, is like this sense of pattern and interconnectedness, and the self dies and everything that can come out of that. It's the psychedelics, it's one of the most important things to happen culturally. Again, it's been happening for thousands of years in indigenous peoples. But it's really important right now in this moment when we grapple with, why do SSRIs not work that well? How do we handle people with PTSD? How do we help them find meaning? And I think psychedelics are going to change that. So absolutely. It's our next big move.
Good.
When you set off to write a book about awe, are there a set of questions that you will set out to answer?
Yeah, the first question, and it's interesting. I started to write this book, sadly, when my younger brother died. He died of a colon cancer, and he and I had shared everything together. So it was a complicated death, and it was a very tough loss. When he was, his life was ending, we were all around him, and I had this awe experience, and I felt like there was light and patterns, and I felt like there are forces that he was moving into. And I'm a reductionist in some sense, and a materialist, and atheist. And I was like, what is that? Why in this moment of profound loss would I feel the sacred and reverence? And that really led me to start writing this book. It's, I have enough data, but I wasn't ready quite career-wise. And I think the first question is like, well, what is it, right? How do I, and it's interesting because in the world of mysticism and psychedelics, Chris, people are like, I can't describe what happened. It's so complex. So first we have to how does science describe this? And then the second question is why? Why in our evolution as a hominid did we develop this emotion? And then third is how can I, in a moment of grief or a period of grief that I'm still in, find awe and recapture what life was about, absent my brother, who he and I hiked together and traveled together, went to Mexico together, swam in the ocean together. He was kind of an awe partner. So those are what I'm trying to answer is what is it and why and how do we get it?
That story, the story of the origins of the book that you're recounting, makes me think about the fact that the word awful has always confused me.
Yeah.
Somehow it's become negative, but my sense is the origins must have been wonderful, and awful meant the same thing, full of awe, right? But also that awe is not necessarily blissful. It can also be whatever it is. I'm in a town right now, Kyle and I are in this little town. It's the only place in North America that has a permit to do open air cremations. Wow. And I attended one a couple of years ago. But I attended this open air cremation. The woman had died of MS. She was a resident of the town. And so her friends and her family were there, and there's a pyre out in the desert. It was early morning at dawn, and her children lit the fire and then spoke about their mother for a while. And then her friends came up and spoke, and it was, whatever those words are, awe-inspiring, awful, wonderful. It was full of things beyond description. But I've had the same experience. My father died about a year and a half ago, and I had the same thing. It was horrible, but it was so so real that it was also nourishing. I don't know if that gets to what you're trying to explain there, but like, we live in such a plastified bullshit world that anything that strips that away is amazing.
Yeah, no, to your first point, Chris, like the etymology of awe comes out of 9th century Norse of agi, which meant fearful, dread, and a little bit of wonder, right? And when you think about the 9th century and what humans were facing in terms of plagues and early death, short life expectancies, a lot of violence. The world was full of horror, right? And they had this word. And then as we've evolved culturally, we have gradually reduced the horrors of living. Children don't die young. We have a much lengthened life expectancy, less violence. There's still a lot of horror, and we've built back in the positive dimensions of awe, of wonder and goose tingling curiosity, back to what awe is. Even our relationship to nature, in the last 300-400 years, we've gotten outdoors, right? We used to fear things, and so the words really have changed, and that's why awful is confusing. And what strikes me, one of our human universals in awe is life and death. And the obvious one is, wow, you see a child born, and you're like, geez, 1 minute there was one person, now there are two. And that's awe-inspiring. and dying, dying, a lot of people have Chris's experience of, I remember one woman told me, like, I had this beloved sister, she got cancer, went through this process of hospice, and I was holding her hand when she died, and then I could feel the life go. And it was awesome, and I think what it tells us is horror is different than awe. So genocides and piles of bodies at Holocausts, at Nazi concentration camps, those may astonish you, but they're horrifying, right? Mm-hmm. But once you get into the other realm and you move away death, things get awesome, right? Like, what is a life and where does it go? So I think it's one of the great mysteries is what you just described, Chris. It's like, why does the mind do that when we face death?
Can you talk about your role working with prisoners and the Sierra Club to get them out into nature?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. They're two different things, So the first is the Sierra Club. In fact, I'm writing about a guy in my book named Stacy Bear, who was a veteran who came back, and a lot of our veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq was really struggling, drinking too much, suicidal. And he talks about it openly. And his buddy got him out rock climbing in Colorado, and it changed his life. It transformed him. And he called me up, and he's like, man, there's this Berkeley guy who's studying awe. This is the key for veterans. Veterans are often like really courageous and adventure oriented. They're young, they're physical, right? They like to throw their bodies into stuff, and they're being handed SSRIs and cocktails, right? Which is not going well. And Stacy called me up, and he's like, hey man, I work at the Sierra Club. I lead tens of thousands of people outdoors on outdoors trips, including veterans and under-resourced teens who are poor and don't get to camp. So we did this study of veterans and teens rafting. Ironically enough, on the river that I grew up on, the American River, where I used to raft as a high school kid with my brother. And we found, my favorite finding in that, we measure saliva before and after. We got GoPro cameras. We filmed them. So we measured they're like, woo, we've got all of that. We have a paper on that. And, or like, whoa, or screaming. But veterans show a 32% drop in PTSD symptoms for a week after a day rafting. I mean, you can't, you try to move a veteran's PTSD,
right?
Like that, man, that is like, take that to the bank.
The veterans sorry. Did the veterans and the teens go together on these trips, or were they separate trips?
That's a great question. And, we really worked hard to curate the trips. And the veterans went together separate from the teens, in part, Chris, because some of our veterans, we had one guy who was homeless, as a lot of veterans, there's 700,000 homeless in the United States. That'll rise because of COVID, And then one of our veterans was from Vietnam. And so getting on a river, we had a lot of kind of guidance and therapy right there because it was hard. And then the teens were crazy. One of my undergrads who ran the trip is named Christoph Green, and he grew up homeless and then went to Berkeley, graduated, doing really well. He's 6'5". He looks like a linebacker, and he's got these big dreadlocks. And I was like, what was it like to do the study? And he had never been camping. It's like, God, it was amazing. But I had to break up splash fights amongst these teenagers. So we had a special approach to the teenagers. Right. Because they were teenagers,
Yeah.
You mentioned measuring things like saliva before and after a trip like this. Can you dig in a little bit more to how you conduct one of these experiments?
Thank you for asking that. And this one was hard. So we got our veterans and teenagers, and that took a lot of work. We've got our river, right? That we're a chunk of the American River. We've checked out, and then GoPro gave us a bunch of cameras. So we mounted the cameras on rafts. So now we've got like 10 rafts, GoPro cameras. We filmed them. And I feel like the key there, just to give your audience a sense of science, like, it's one thing to say, hey, you're a big wave surfer. What's it like for you on the waves? And they say, oh, I feel awe, right? Okay. Kind of obvious. It's another thing to show when you're surfing or rafting, your physiology changes. And my lab has done a lot of work on how awe, our focus today, activates the vagus nerve, which is this bundle of nerves that makes you strong. Awe reduces the inflammation in the body, which is part of your immune system. They're little proteins that attack pathogens in your body that are good. But if you're always inflamed, you're really vulnerable to, like the plastified life that Chris referred to makes your body inflamed. We lose touch with nature, and that's bad news for your health. So in this particular study, given that orientation, number one is we gathered saliva. You got these teenagers arriving at the river, and my experience, we bought a special fridge, right? And the teenagers, okay, great, welcome to the study. Now spit into this vial. right? So like spit.
It's for
By the way,
science.
yeah. By the way, like getting enough spit is hard, right? You got like, so we got that. And then if I showed you footage, and maybe you could post it on your for the show. It's one thing like, oh, I felt awe during the rafting trip. It's another thing when you got them on camera and they're going like, whoa, as they ride through the meat grinder and all these rapids and almost crash into rocks. So saliva, self-report measures to start the study, film them during the rafting trip, and then we follow them up online on their smartphones 1 week after, like, hey, how are you doing? Are you stressed? Is your sleep disrupted? Are you PTSD? We put that all together and we can get a sense of like, what does a day on the river do for you, right? And what we find is you show a lot of awe in the voice and the face, your cortisol changes, you emerge with other people in your raft in terms of physiology. It starts to resemble, you're like, wow, man, we're part of this team. And that all predicts less PTSD a week later, right? So it just gives us a feel of what it's really like.
Can you talk, I've quoted you, I've written 2 books, and I've cited you in both of them. Thank you.
Oh.
You know what it's like, right? The first book is about human sexuality in prehistory, which doesn't seem to have a lot of overlap with your work, but I found ways. And the second one is called Civilized to Death, that just came out in October,
Nice.
which is sort of a reassessment of the cost-benefit analysis of civilization, right? Are we actually better off than hunter-gatherers, and in which ways? And sort of re-examining a lot of the mythology, I hate to use the word mythology to imply falsity, but the bias, the pro-status quo bias in examining hunter-gatherers. And I know so much of your work looks at those same questions. Can you just talk about some of your studies, like the monopoly study? Like, I have a whole section in Civilized to Death called Rich Asshole Syndrome, where I argue that it's not just that assholes become rich because they're willing to cut corners that more ethical people aren't. It's also that wealth disparities force us to develop almost like a spiritual scar tissue that deadens us to the pain of other people to enable us to continue to live in this unnatural situation. I cited your monopoly study, your study of the expensive cars stopping less often than your work is so good at illuminating those things. I wonder if you could just describe some of those studies, but also the greater sense that I have that a lot of your work is really very subversive. You're teaching at a major university, but you're questioning some of the fundamental principles of Western civilization.
Wow, I should travel with you more often, Chris, because that's quite and congratulations on your book. I know about your first book, and I look forward to reading your next one too. Yeah, so and what an important summary. So it begins, the work begins with really interesting thing that happened to me as a kid and I wrote about this at the end of this book, The Power Paradox, where I was living, it was 1970, and my mom got her PhD, and she was our family breadwinner, and she taught at Sacramento State University, big public university. And we moved from a middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles, and because my parents were hippies, which is why I'm subversive in part, we moved to this town where we got 5 acres and a beat-up old house, and it was in one of the poorest towns in Northern California. The kids I grew up in, I was 5th grade when I started there. They just seemed like they were sick and had trouble concentrating, and you go to their homes and, sometimes it felt a little like Appalachia. I'm not sure they were eating well. A kid came over to and played on our swing, where you would jump off. My brother and I had done it 1,000 times, and he did it. And the second time he did it, his arm snapped in half. And I was like, I started to do this work on power that Chris is, and I'll get to it in a second. And it just pushed me backward. Like, why were all the kids I moved to suddenly like sick and not going to college and maybe not graduating and turning to opiates early and crystal meth and tough, right? And it's because of capitalism and our society and rich assholes. And then when I was teaching, a paper came out in 1994 that showed that poor people die earlier of every disease compared to wealthy people. And it's so striking. If I'm a 7 on a 10-point scale and my neighbor's an 8, and we go to the same doctor and we eat the same food and we do the same exercise, he's going to live longer than me, right? Just by this sense of rank. And Chris, that led me to this work. And the first thing that was striking, like when you study hunter-gatherer peoples with whom we evolved for 200,000 years, they didn't have rich assholes, right? They constrained them. They were much more egalitarian. If you were grabbing too much food, people would correct you, right? And really, inequality in the United States really hits hard in the 70s and just explodes, right? So now we have, Trump's family is the idea that Jared Kushner, who his dad bought his way into Harvard. I'm not sure he even went to class. The idea that he would be making these decisions is offensive. And so our job then was to really capture, like, how does wealth and inequality, like you're saying, Chris, does it produce assholes or unethical behavior? And my favorite study is the car study, where I was biking home and coming through a four-way stop sign, and this black Mercedes that was worth $150,000, like, rolls the stop sign at 25 miles an hour. I'm going uphill, turns almost into me. We're like face to face. And he gets really mad at me. And I'm like, dude, I was following the law, man. You almost killed me. I'm on a bike and you're getting mad at me. So we did the car study. And what happens in that study is, and it's Paul Piff's genius, who is my collaborator, who's now a professor at Irvine. We put an undergrad, everybody has car stories, right? And I'll talk about it in just a second, and you're just like, cars, by the way, like, people dying in cars over 100,000 people die each year, I think, in cars. A lot of people hurt their bodies in cars. It shortens our lives, traffic, et cetera, California. So we put an undergrad at the edge of a pedestrian zone near our Berkeley campus. And that's crosses the street. It's white stripes. It's California law. You have to stop, right? And we have another Berkeley undergrad hiding behind this bush. And they make sure that if a car's coming, they note what kind of car it is. And there's our other person, like, looking like they want to cross the pedestrian zone. And we just ask, do they stop? It's the law, right? 100% of drivers of poor cars stop. And once you get up to the fancy cars, BMW, like really expensive cars, 46% of the time they drive through the pedestrian zone, right? And I know that is it. I can see you getting mad.
You're doing this study in Berkeley. So even the wealthy people in Berkeley are probably consider themselves progressive. They've got their, shopping bags in the back of the car. They recycle, right?
Oh yeah.
It would be. I mean, if you did this study in Los Angeles, Culver City, just some random area, not Berkeley, I'll bet the percentages would be even more dramatic.
Yeah, that's really cool. No one's ever brought that up. What about the Berkeley effect? I mean, it's even stronger in Berkeley, where we're supposed to be progressive, and so I agree. And that was the tip of the iceberg. And so, we did all these studies, and you give a well-to-do person at They're playing a game as part of an experiment. This is my other favorite one.
I love that one.
Yeah, they're playing this game. You press a button, it rolls a bunch of dice on a computer, and you get a score. And if you get a high score, you get to win some money. And so we keep track. We know what their score is going to be, and we find out, do they cheat? Rich people are more likely to cheat to win a little bit of money. Now think about that economically, which you may be like, you already got enough money. You don't need $20, and you're cheating. So we did a lot of these studies, and I believe I wish I would have known how to write this. I think this is one of the fundamental problems of our society right now: is cheating, is corruption, is the gaming of the systems that most of us hope are fair. And by rich people, and you can't. This has replicated in countries around the world. It has all kinds of other extensions. And I think it's a central problem in our country that is hard to fight.
It's interesting that you brought up the 1970s. There's a great documentary called Requiem for an American Dream. It's a Noam Chomsky documentary. And he talks about how in the 60s you had this fiercely democratization. You had a lot of young, typically apathetic people out in the streets demanding change. And Chomsky talks about how in the 1970s, one thing that he didn't predict was the blowback and deregulation from the establishment. You get into the savings and loans crises, the Reagan administration, and then all of a sudden you have much more inequality, and that just continues to ramp up until today.
Thank you for bringing that up. And I mean, part of what got me to social class and inequality was Chomsky and Marx and Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saaz, his Berkeley collaborator. And, Chris was heading towards one of the fallouts of this, right? Which is, how do we think about human beings in our contemporary world? And what's our natural state? And part of my work is to call a lot of that into question, right? That, rational choice theory and economics and Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman would say greed is good, and we love competition, and we just want as much for ourselves compared to other people. And there are dozens of studies that blow that to pieces, right? That we want material goods, and that's not a path to happiness. So this work on the rich asshole syndrome, which has been replicated in every kind of social behavior you would care about. One of my favorites is if you watch people at work, well-to-do managers are more likely to swear at their colleagues and tell them their work is chicken shit than vice versa, than less well-to-do employees. It's part of a whole mix, an ideological mix that Chris was pointing to, and you nicely bring up, Kyle, of like, hey, let's have unfettered greed and capitalism. And that really was for a subset of people, and we know what it does to them.
I think your microphone has slipped into your shirt. You might want to just.
Oh no!
Yeah.
Okay. There you go.
It's not terrible, but it was a little rub. You're referring to Ayn Rand, probably. I know you've written about her a little bit. She's sort of like the supreme apologist for this kind of self. She wrote a book called "In Defense of Selfishness," I think, or an essay. I was briefly. Like a lot of people, I briefly sort of read some of her stuff in high school when I was convinced I'd never die and everyone should just look out for themselves, and my parents were paying all my bills. And I don't know. I think you and I are roughly the same age. Maybe were you into Rush at any point in your life?
A little flurry in my senior year in high school.
Yeah, right. So Ayn Rand, like one of their records, Neil Peart was reading Ayn Rand, and there are some songs that were sort of based on that. But like Alan Greenspan was her acolyte, right? Like he literally sat at her feet, and then he ran the U.S. economy for 20 years. It's just incredible how that stuff works.
Yeah, and Paul Ryan, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
For people who don't know who's Ayn Rand, and I wrote down a quote from her, which is, "For any civilization to survive, it is the morality of altruism that men must reject."
Yeah.
Which is
so
the opposite
Ayn Rand,
of true.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's why we're here today, is our cooperative tendencies. Yeah, the, um, the, Ayn Rand, very influential libertarian philosopher, kudos to her, shaped Greenspan, Reagan, Dick Cheney, Paul Ryan, Donald Trump is a fan, on down the line. And the philosophy of freedom and self-expression and don't rely on other people. Parts of it are great, right? And I try to always remember, there are good sides to many things. And the idea of freedom, and it's interesting, Chris, like when you're 18, to really dwell in the philosophy of like, go out on your own. That's wonderful, right? That's American transcendentalism. It's Emerson, Thoreau. We need that. But it's a lie. It is a lie to think that you make it on your own. It is a lie to think that we can reject altruism. The people who do it are probably much more likely to be supported by governmental policies, and resources. And I think COVID-19, which we're in the midst of, is revealing that. It's like a big X-ray that is saying, look at all the systems that allow my health to stay good, or me to do my work at home when the poorer person has to drive the bus and is more vulnerable to COVID. So, yeah, and Chris, to your point, like, she is related to this set of ideas that humans are selfish, competitive, adversarial, and greedy. And that's our core motivation. And in my book, Born to Be Good, and then all the science we do on the brain and genetics and behavior says about 40% of the time we're ready to share everything, right? We will share 40% of a resource. Big parts of our brain help us do that. And it's good for your life expectancy and your reproductive opportunities. So if I were a different kind of scholar, I remember I was on vacation with a friend and I was like, the book I would love to write is how, why Ayn Rand is the most stupid philosopher who's ever. So thank you for bringing that up. But I'm definitely
yeah.
write that book.
Well, that's me. Both of my books are refutations of what I call the neo-Hobbesian perspective, right? Which Ayn Rand is obviously just a sort of modern articulation of that. But that famous quote that life before the state was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short is wrong. It's wrong in every possible way. And yet it's one of the most powerful lines in the English language. It's amazing. Do you ever think that the... Go ahead.
No, it'd be interesting to take all these sayings that and just say, here's how it's all wrong. I mean, that'd be a neat book.
Yeah. Well, that's essentially Civilized to Death is organized that way. That's how I introduce it. Like, this book is going to show you Hobbes was totally wrong. But do you ever think that the utility of an idea is at least as determinative of its power and ubiquity as the clarity of thought? In other words, Darwin wrote about love a lot more than he wrote about competition, but Darwinian competition has been co-opted as sort of a central justification for ruthless capitalism. Yeah,
that's really, I think that there are a couple of things to unpack there. One is their ideas are promoted through institutions that have ideologies. And Darwin did not, as you nicely just put it, Chris, he was not survival of the fittest. He was survival of the kindest. And that comes straight out of The Descent of Man from 1871. And no one knows that, right? And everybody thinks he said it's survival of the superior. He didn't say that, And then the other thing, you're right, is, there is interesting work about virality. And virality tends to, like fake news and gore and violence and stuff. And the more dramatic, even untrue, disturbing kinds of claims can spread pretty powerfully. And we're at battle against that tendency. Man, you make me worry now.
Yeah, that's what happens when you hang out with Chris long enough.
Sorry.
Your Pollyannish tendencies blow away with the wind.
I know. Yeah. Dang, we're in trouble. Ayn Rand's going to win.
Yeah. Yeah.
You brought up fake news, and I know that you've worked with a ton of different organizations and really promote the idea of subordinates being able to critique people in power. And journalism is one of those, the estates that we have, that is, the mechanism of it is to be able to critique power. Can you talk specifically about that, as well as organizations that you've seen that really set up a structure where critiquing power is encouraged?
Yeah, when I wrote about power, probably guided by a lot of what Chris was hinting at, which is, for several 100,000 years, as we evolved in these small hunter-gatherer groups, power was really negotiated, right? And it was contested and distributed in a more horizontal way. That's Christopher Bohm reviewing 48 different societies. And one of the things that they were really sophisticated at is the critique of the powerful. And they would do it in telling jokes and gossiping, the informal structures by which we rein in the abuse of power. Hey, some guy's bragging and you tease him about his bragging, or he eats too much food and you tease him about that. And that really led to, alongside ethics and morals, like it is the foundation of critique, of social critique. And it was built into the structure that low power people, who are always stronger in number than high power individuals, could critique. And then you see that develop into journalism in the 18th century, and local newspapers who made fun of the wealthy, right, and so forth, and satire, and Jonathan Swift, and just everything good. And so, to me, that's one of the healthy markers of a healthy power society, or a society that has healthy power. You go to Russia or China. I was on the equivalent of 60 Minutes in China, which for at this conference, it was a joke. It was not even journalism, So absolutely. And I think, like when, institutions rate, the US is now a fragile democracy. It used to be a strong democracy. And part of the reason is the degradation of journalism, right, and the attack on it. And that's one of the most scary things about Trump. So I think it's foundational, and it is at risk right now, because of the digital technologies. I consulted at Facebook for 6 years prior to the big blow up, and I was struck at that they couldn't take a more firm stand on bad rhetoric. They just wouldn't, they wouldn't take that step. Whereas it's funny, we all, like if we were all part of a group and there's a person over there that's spewing bile and fake news, we'd be like, hey man, that's not true, and we would negotiate that. Facebook didn't take that step, right, which was too bad. So I think it's precious, Kyle, and I'm really glad you're bringing it up.
And do you have any examples of organizations that you've worked with that set up a structure where they really encourage critique, or any kind of specific tactics that you've noticed as shining examples?
Well, it's so interesting to me, and I would love it'd be. This is so the first, and I don't want to, is science. And what people don't realize is science goes through blind peer review. And what that means is every paper I publish gets, on average, 20 single-space pages of what an idiot I am and how wrong this idea is, and what a simplistic, simple-minded idea. And it is, we contest things, right?
Hey, that's what Chris does for me every day.
He is Mr. Blind Peer Review.
He just does it in a verbal diatribe, not written word.
But when you think about it, just think about that for a second, right? Like any idea you want to put out there, how much oversight that puts into your peers' hands. And that's why science is making a lot of progress. We're making extraordinary progress. And there are facts and there are things that we can trust, right? Medicine is another. Like when you really get down to, in particular, everyday healthcare, they evaluate each other's performance. Patients evaluate doctors, right? So there are a lot of data and separate opinions on how well you're doing things. You go to other realms and you don't have that, right? Which is interesting. You don't have peer review. So I would cite those two. I think sports are interesting. Sports have a ton of data in them and they're getting better. There's no, we have a ton of data. It's a fairly meritocratic system of whoever the best people will rise for the most part. And performance is better and teams are better. So I think it's a great question to be thinking about with respect to our systems. It's very hard, as Michael Lewis has revealed, to get peer review of financial commodities.
You just read my mind. I was going to ask you if you knew Michael Lewis, because I know he lives in Berkeley.
I do.
And you mentioned the sports and the analysis. He's great. He's fucking...
Yeah. And when you ask him, like, his analysis, he's a dear friend. And when you read his book, The Big Short, and you're like, how did these people create these collateralized debt swaps that cost millions of jobs and hurt millions of families? And there was no peer review of those products. And had they been submitted to a group of people and say, is this a good thing? People are like, this is ridiculous, right? So it's interesting to think about where peers can critique us and where they can't.
Well, also, I agree with what you said about science, but I think it's nuanced, because if you submitted that to a bunch of investment bankers, they would say, this is a great product. It takes money from a whole bunch of people and gives it to us. That's what we're in the business of doing. Perfect product. Right. And in medicine, so often, a product is tested and it's no better than placebo. And so that information is never published because the research is sponsored by the company. So they don't publish it until they get the results they want. It's like that money is corroding not only our political system, but even our scientific systems.
Yeah. And, thanks. Absolutely, Chris. And, and you are nicely engaging in exactly what we're talking about, right? Which is let's scrutinize ideas and claims with reason. So I just said science, but there are biases in scientific evaluation. There are hidden findings, et cetera. There's probably status effects of, we treat women's papers differently than men's, et cetera. Medicine has tons of, the pharmaceutical industry is shrouded in hidden findings. And so, and I don't know what you guys think, but I feel in some sense, while there's a lot of junk and fake news, at the same time, all of the digital exchange and flow of information, it allows for critiques, right? That can make, when I go give a public talk now, I've been told, somebody will tweet, the guy got it wrong. Dacher got this wrong or whatever. So there is more opportunity for public scrutiny. I think the challenge is what you're pointing to, which is it has to be done in principled fashion, and that's where it gets hard.
I think one of the, Kyle referred to my sort of dark worldview earlier, which
Can't wait to read this.
I'm
Civilized to death.
Dude, yeah, you'll weep. But I, the way I see life, I'm sort of like having a really good time at the party on the Titanic as it's sinking, right? But I'm still having fun, right? But I wonder what you think about, to follow up on your point, I think that podcasts are possibly, and this is self-serving, but I think they're possibly as impactful as the printing press, in the sense that, we can talk to anybody we want who's willing to sit down and talk to us using any language we want, and press a button and, hundreds of thousands of people can listen to that, or millions if Joe Rogan happens to be in the room. And that's amazing. There's no gatekeeper. There's nobody between us and the audience, which I think is truly revolutionary.
Yeah, no, I think there's 700,000 podcasts in the United States. And I think that would be a cool book, right? Because it is profoundly revolutionary in being local, right? Like big wave surfing is a spectacular phenomenon. It probably doesn't make the newspaper, people are reporting on the local softball team scores, but not the big wave surfing score.
Only if someone gets eaten by a shark.
Yeah, exactly. So it's off the radar.
If Joe Rogan's in the room for podcasting, or if a shark is in the room for big wave surfing.
So it has this wonderful local organic feel, and that's why it is it's one of the most important things in journalism right now. It probably the most important. And for me, we've got the Science of Happiness and podcast, which has done well. And what's been exciting for me, to your point, Chris, is like, I've been teaching the Science of Happiness. I have my certain frustrations with it. It's not diverse. It doesn't deal with social justice. It doesn't mention Noam Chomsky like we did today. And I'm like, man, and I'm hearing it from young people. And I'm like, if I have this podcast, I'm going to have prisoners on. I'm going to have ex-prisoners. I'm going to have people who are junkies, et cetera, to get at the local kind of quality so I think they are exciting and a great new venue.
And it's an antidote to that plastification that we were talking about before. I think a lot of people have grown up with everything being filtered and test marketed, and it's just it reeks of inauthenticity. That if they hear somebody, even if they disagree, but they hear someone just giving it straight, the pendulum is starting to swing. People are so hungry for that now, I think.
Yeah. It's so funny. My daughter, who's just graduated from Berkeley, is 22, Natalie, and she loves podcasts and is part of the podcast generation, like young people. And you have regular voices and grammatical problems and, just drama and so forth. And when she looks at, the television and our talking heads, she's just like, come on. So I hear you. Podcasts.
Here's to podcasts. I wonder, just to follow up on this point you were making about, skepticism and that Kyle was asking about daring to challenge power structures and so on. Yeah. I wonder what you think about so-called conspiracy theories, flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, all that kind of stuff. Because I find it very problematic because I applaud the skepticism. You know what I mean? Like question
Absolutely.
What the government tells you, the Gulf of Tonkin incident was bullshit, all this stuff is bullshit. But then are people still teaching critical thinking? Like, is there a mandatory critical thinking class at Berkeley?
There's a lot of critical thinking at Berkeley, and I think that, I think universities do a good job of that. One of my favorite findings in social science is called the Flynn effect, which is people are getting smarter compared to where we were in terms of handling information. We may not be living as well, but we know how to handle information better. Knowledge is getting better. I'm totally with you, Chris, and we should go have a beer sometime, man. Because, I grew up skeptical of. I read Noam Chomsky, and our mainstream media, even the hallowed New York Times, has tons of ideological bias. Right? Good luck ever reading a pro-Palestinian piece in there. I grew up, thanks to my mom, very skeptical of pharmaceuticals, and she was right. The SSRIs. There are a lot of data that call into question pharmaceutical approaches to mental health. And now we have a weird convergence of that in the anti-vaxxers, which is don't trust government, don't trust mainstream portrayals of vaccines. And I hope the broader public will have independent science, like you suggest, and we'll see where it lands, right? because probably we need the vaccines. And so it's just fascinating right now that the liberal critique of 30 years ago, Noam Chomsky, Vietnam and protests and corporate greed and so forth, has now been turned upon political leaders by Trump supporters.
I've even thought of it in terms of economics. I haven't talked about this yet on the podcast, but I was thinking recently how, there's a very strong strain of do your own thing in the hippie movement, right? Like, if it feels good, do it. I remember a T-shirt with a bear rubbing his back on a tree, and it said, "If it feels good, do it." And there's this all like, "Hey, man, I'm an individual. I'm going to do what's good for me. Look out for number one." All these slogans from back in the late '60s, early '70s, and like that sort of transformed into Reaganite trickle-down economics. Get the government off my back. It's strange how like the far left and the far right kind of meet somewhere in there.
Man. So, and I'm going to use the word, but patriarchy, right? And they're like feminist critiques of the 70s, Ruth Rosen in particular, who's a professor at Davis, like a lot of the 60s kind of rebuilt patriarchy, and men had nice positions, they had more sexual freedom, right? They had women bringing coffee to them. They were the voices in the movements. And there was a patriarchal dimension to it outside of the feminist movement of Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and others. And it nicely transported right over to Reagan. It felt the same, right? So really interesting. Really cool. Good idea.
Can you talk about the role that equal rights between women and men have in healthy societies historically? And just watch your microphone because it's kind of scratching up against your shirt a little bit.
Okay, sorry. My apologies. I was getting way too comfortable lounging into the observations. I know. Wow.
We should all be in hammocks really right now. We should do a hammock podcast together.
I'm not very nimble.
I've got a theory. I don't know if I don't mean to detract, to jump in here, but my theory is that the hammock is the first human invention. It's the first human technology because chimps and bonobos both weave branches together and sleep in them every night, right? Up above the ground, keep away from predators and so on. You're waving in the breeze. Wow. So my whole philosophy of life goes back to the hammock.
Yeah. I'm going to order one right now.
Let us send you one. Swag.
Be good swag for the podcast.
It's interesting, Kyle. So I, as you guys nicely mentioned, I did a lot of work on the abuse of power and class and inequality. Wrote this book, The Power Paradox. It summed it up. And about when The Power Paradox was published, Weinstein happened, the Me Too movement, which I got involved in. I wrote and then got connected to women's groups. And then the deeper question surfaced around that, which is, well, will organizations or will a nation or will a community abuse power depending on who's in charge, right? If it's a man or a greater representation of women. And what's interesting, and Hannah Rosen has written a little bit about this, but this is one of the hottest topics in power, which is that women have more power now societally than they've had in 15,000 years. And you just go from the big transition to settlements, which became patriarchal 12,000 years ago, through time that, 30% of governors are women. The last election had the most women elected to Congress in history, I think. Female vice president candidates, et cetera, leading organizations. The one place where they're not effectively represented is in the super high echelons of CEOs and hedge funds. But middle-level managers, lawyers, doctors, it's all rising. And that begs the question of what happens with respect to power and the abuse of power. And some of the data suggests that with more women and the greater equal distribution of power, you have less abuse. There is a big McKinsey study and a big study by Credit Suisse looking at governments and companies with more women on boards, and they don't abuse power to quite the same extent. They take care of labor. So a lot of the income issues right now in the United States probably would be less extreme if women were making those decisions. So a little bit of hope in this civilized to death world.
Do you think that the structures and the flow of power as they're established in corporations and many governments are themselves reflective of patriarchy and the male? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, do you think that men and women wield and understand power in different ways? And therefore, is it sufficient to have women in these positions? Because when I was writing Sex at Dawn, I was addressing the fact that most anthropologists would say there has never been a matriarchy, right? I was addressing the idea that hunter-gatherer men and women were both autonomous and had similar levels of power within the society. Right. And a lot of mainstream theorists would say, but then why is there no matriarchy? And what I found was, well, there are societies in which property is passed from mother to daughter and women's voices are necessary to any decision, but that a matriarchy doesn't look like a patriarchy in the mirror. It's not a flipped, you don't have a woman with her high heel on a man's throat the way you have men, wielding power over women.
Yeah. Yeah, so great to hear you say that, because coming out, I think Trump shocked a lot of people, not, people who are reading the tea leaves in the Midwest, but, and, there's been endless analysis of him and his power, and wow, just kind of this bald self-interest and, kind of Machiavellian, like just taking people down, et cetera. And coming out of that election, to answer your question, Chris, we developed, people hadn't studied it rigorously and scientifically. There had been certain kinds of cultural analysis, but it hadn't really been addressed with data, if you will. And we've got a measure of like, what do you think about power and how do you use it? And there's more of a horizontalist approach of like, it's about collaboration and, bidirectionality, and it's distributed. And then there's the top down, like it's about force and coercion and violence. And men are way more likely to adhere to that second model of power, right? That international diplomacy is weak. You got to use force. Fathers should really rule the family. Teachers are okay to spank the kids, et cetera. And women are more likely to be more horizontal, right, and collaborative. So I think it's profound. And in the next 30 years, we'll see what happens to organizations because women are starting to run them. Do
you think those differences are innate or culturally indoctrinated?
Oh, man, that's a tough one. I think, there are certain... when, my last read of the violence literature, maybe more up-to-date data, Chris and Kyle, like 85-90% of violence is male, and so you gotta, social relationships deal with that if you're a male. And so you learn how to use violence for power and counteract it. And, women, there are cool data showing with birth, men have the neurophysiology of connection, but it's very pronounced in women for a year or two of oxytocin and breastfeeding and all that comes with that. That's we don't like to say, but that is a very significant event that shifts your body. So, I'd say part of
you mentioned
a chunk is nature. A chunk is nature.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. You mentioned Christopher Boehm's work earlier. Hierarchy in the Forest is probably his best known book. What I love about that is that he does not say that humans are not hierarchical. He says that we developed very complex mechanisms for counteracting that tendency. Yeah. And most of those mechanisms involve men. Because men are more likely, I think, innately to try to take over and inflict coercive power on others. And so, people who are interested in those issues should really check his work out.
Yeah. And thanks for bringing that up, Chris, because it's subtle work, right? We often think of like power is either good or bad, right? Or hierarchies either exist or don't exist. There are hierarchies everywhere, right? That's a raw fact of social life. And what he says is, just like you're saying, like healthy hierarchies have these dynamic tensions, right? And bidirectional negotiations. So
and on the, yeah, definitely. And Franz de Waal, I'm sure you're familiar with his work, showing that the impulse toward justice and the sort of aversion of injustice is something that's common to all social primates. Yeah. So it's not something that's imposed by government. It comes out of us innately.
Absolutely. Great. I love Franz.
Dacher, this is my last question, then I'll let Chris wrap it up. But in regards to nuance and teaching the next generation more compassion, you talk about the benefits of exposing kids to suffering, which is something that people might, at first glance, not think is a good thing to do. Can you dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah. Wow. I appreciate all of these questions and the scholarship behind them. And so my lab, I was sitting on a panel. I was lucky enough to have this experience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And he said, just in a throwaway statement, compassion is our natural state. And boy, does that fly in the face of Ayn Rand, whom we talked about earlier. We got to reject compassion and altruism. And I'm a scientist, and I heard that statement in 2003, I think. And I was like, I got to go after that with neurophysiology and science. And so we started to study human compassion in the lab. And when you study compassion in the lab, you show people images of suffering, right? Starving children, pets that are dying, kids with cancer, classic stuff, right? And what we found, and this is to your first point, I mean, as we started to summarize this literature on compassion, parts of your prefrontal cortex are activated. It activates the vagus nerve, which makes you feel good and strong and connected. It activates oxytocin release. It has a gene that is related to oxytocin. It makes you feel strong. It makes you want to assist others. It makes you be courageous. These are all peer-reviewed scientific findings of what happens when I'm exposed to suffering. Is just like we talked about earlier, how our capacity for awe is awakened when we encounter dying, right? It's horrific, but our imagination gets going. And in the case of compassion, we want to make things better. That science complemented just my everyday experience, like around the veterans, right? That when they were exposed to the most profound suffering I've heard of, watching a bomb blow up a buddy or a school kid, watching the body die, they wanted to do better, right? They wanted to do things that were good for the world, just very routinely. And that led me to this kind of statement, like, maybe we shield our kids from suffering, which is good, but maybe in their lives, they need to figure out what part of suffering they want to help, right? And I believe that to be true. And, when I say goodbye to my Berkeley undergrads, one of the things I say is like, find the form of suffering or injustice that you want to work on. Because Chris cites the work, Franz de Waal, we get agitated when there's suffering and harm in others and injustice. We want to fix it. So find one. For me, it was, veterans or getting into prisons and working with those guys and go get it, And a lot of the, data suggests that's good news for people. And it's counterintuitive. It's painful for the eyes, but it's good for our souls.
I read some research, it may have even been your research, showing that the number one predictor of life satisfaction and longevity is whether or not you feel that you're embedded in a caring community.
Yeah. I mean, human happiness, being in a caring community gives you 10 years of life expectancy. Older people who volunteer are much less likely to die, right? I mean, there are just so many findings on this that, and this is where I'm so grateful that you guys brought up Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and this horse shit of, just go out and maximize self-interest, because it countervails that. And that's a malaise, right? That is a delusion that's been harmful to our society.
Listen, we would love to dominate the rest of your afternoon, but
and vice versa.
Being cooperative.
We'd like to be egalitarian.
Yeah, exactly. I want to thank you so much for doing this, and I want to thank Kyle so much for letting me kind of horn in here, because I've been doing the podcast a lot longer than he has. And when he mentioned that he had you as a guest, I'm sure he saw a look go over my face like, what the fuck? How did you get that guy? It's fantastic. So thank both of you for letting me sit in on this.
Well, I love your writing,
to
Chris.
bring it up in a very laissez-faire way as well. Like, yeah, I just got this guy on the podcast. He's like, what? I wrote about this guy in both my books.
You can't use my Wi-Fi if I'm not involved.
Yeah.
Well, let's do it again.
Well, hey.
I would love to. Yeah.
Well, hey, where can people check out your work, and what books should they buy of yours?
Yeah. So number one is greatergood.berkeley.edu, which is all things greater good and a lot of this science. Then my books are The Power Paradox, which we've talked about in Born to Be Good. And then I have a new book on awe. And Kyle, the other thing I'll just say is, as you know, I'm writing a book about awe. Have a lot of admiration for surfers, have dear friends who are surfers, daughter's a surfer. And if you have listeners who want to send me their stories of awe on big waves, I'm collecting stories of awe from around the world, and they've been amazing. So send them my way at keltner@berkeley.edu.
Hey, it's Kyle again. Head over to trendswithbenefits.com and sign up for our newsletter to get weekly stories about psychedelics, adventure, well-being, and more. And if you dig this podcast, please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts. It takes less than 60 seconds and helps us book hard-to-get guests.